Erev Tov Rabotai, we're continuing with our Mishna Yomi Masechet Demai. We're up to Perek Bet Mishnah Hey. In yesterday's Mishnah, we spoke about the rule the Chachamim set. If a seller sells a large quantity of produce, since he's not making a lot of money because he's selling it in bulk, he does not have to remove the Demai before he sells it. The buyer will have to remove it himself. And when a seller sells, a retail seller, he sells in smaller quantities, since he makes a lot of profit, the Chachamim made it an obligation upon him, the seller, to remove the tithes, Masel Sheni, whatever it entails, and he's not allowed to sell it with the Demai. So the Mishnah now is going to discuss, let's say a person flipped it. A person took something that's generally sold in bulk and sold it in a smaller quantity. Or a person took what's generally sold in a smaller quantity and sold it in bulk. Do we follow the reality of how much you sold in the quantity, or do we follow the rule that the sages enacted? We're going to follow the text of the Mishnah that we have, which is how the Rambam learns it. The Ravadim Baltanura on the side has a different version of the Mishnah, but since it's not our text, we're not going to follow it. Rabbi Meir says, Et shedarko limaded bagasa umidado badaka, tfilat daka lagasa. Anything that is usually measured, meaning anything that's usually sold with a large measure, like wheat, it's usually sold in bulk. In this case, even though you measured it with a small measure, you sold it in small amounts, tfilat daka lagasa, the small measure is tefillah, insignificant, irrelevant regarding the larger one, and it is considered as if you made a sale in bulk, even though you sold small. Why? Because Rabbi Meir holds, we don't follow a reality of what you sold. We follow what's usually sold, how much usually sold by this produce. So since you took something that's generally sold in bulk, like wheat, and sold it in a smaller quantity, we look at the rule. Since it's generally sold in bulk, you do not have to remove the Demai before you sell it. You could sell it, and it's upon the buyer to remove it. The Chachamim, according to Rabbi Meir, we look at the rule, not at the reality. We're going to see later, Chachamim hold, we look at the reality of how much you sold. Rabbi Meir continues, that which is usually sold in smaller quantities, like beans, kitniot, but in this case, you sold it in a larger measure, a larger quantity in bulk. The larger measure is insignificant in relative to the smaller one, and we look at it as if you made a small sale. Therefore, the seller would have to remove the Demai before he sells it, because again, we follow the usual manner and not the reality. So again, Rabbi Meir says, if you take something that's generally sold in bulk and sell it in a smaller quantity, you don't have to take off Demai, because we look at it's generally sold in bulk. Here, if you took something that's generally sold in smaller quantities and you sold it in bulk, we look at the fact that it's generally sold in smaller quantities, and you would have to remove the Demai before you sell it. Now the Mishnah says, Ezoi midat gasa, what is considered a large measure? By yavesh shloshet kabin, by dry solid foods, it's 3 kab, which is a volume equivalent to 24 eggs. Ubalach dinar, but by liquids, Chachamim didn't give a volume amount, they gave a money amount, dinar. Because since the price always fluctuates because of shipping, handling, etc., they didn't want to make it by volume. The price fluctuates, so they wanted to make it by price. Now, the Mishnah continues to tell us, Rabbi Yossi says, Saleh te'enim b'saleh anabim b'kupot shel yarak, kol zman shumuchan achsera patur. Regarding baskets of figs, baskets of grapes, and boxes of vegetables, Rabbi Yossi says, as long as you sell it achsira, which the Mefarshim explain is by estimation, you don't count it, you don't measure it, you don't weigh it, you're exempt from Demai, the Demai tithing requirement, because the Mefarshim explain, according to Rabbi Yossi, since the seller is not counting, he's selling an estimation, he has to add extra produce, thereby lowering his profits. So the Chachamim, Rabbi Yossi holds that the obligation of Demai wouldn't apply to him, he's allowed to sell it without tithing it. Whereas the sages disagree with Rabbi Yossi, and they say that even in this case, the seller has to remove the Demai, since he's selling it in small amounts. And the Rab says the halakha does not follow Rabbi Yossi, the halakha follows the Chachamim. That is the end of Perek Bet. Perek Gimel Mishnah Aleph now discusses more leniencies that regarding Demai. Since most Emei Aratzot, again, they separate the tithes, and we're only concerned for the minority, Chachamim have certain leniencies regarding Demai. Ma'achrin et ha'anim Demai ve'et ha'achsanya Demai. We're allowed to feed poor people Demai, even poor Torah scholars, ve'et poor chaverim, ve'et ha'achsanya Demai. We're allowed to feed traveling Jewish soldiers Demai. Now the Mefarshim explain, poor people that come and they knock on the door and they beg you for food, you're allowed to give them the demai and the produce that you bought from Namaritz that's suspected of not being tithed, and the poor person's allowed to eat it even without tithing it, and it makes no difference whether he's a poor Hamaritz or a poor Tamid Chacham. They are allowed to take it and eat it without tithing it, because since most Amaratzot tithe it, and we're only concerned for the minority, Chachamim are lenient. However, the Rav says you must inform them that you bought it from Amaretz and you didn't tithe it, and it's upon them if they want to tithe it or not. Likewise, we're allowed to feed the traveling Jewish soldiers Demai, and the Rav explains that it's talking about a Jewish soldier that's traveling from place to place, and therefore it's upon the townspeople that the town he is in, they have to feed him, so they're allowed to feed him Demai while he passes, because again, since most Amaratzot tithed it, and we're only following we're afraid of the minority, we're allowed to give it to him. However, if he stays over the night, he's not just passing by, now we view it as if he's living in the town temporarily, and now we have to give him produce that is clean of Demai. Rabban Gamliel took it even further. He would feed his poor workers Demai. Now Rabban Gamliel's svara, his logic was, since the workers are poor, and poor people are allowed to eat Demai, I can feed them Demai. However, the Mefarshim explain that just as a understanding why Rabban Gamliel even fed them, that the custom where Rabban Gamliel lived was when you hired workers, you are obligated to feed them. That was their custom. So Rabban Gamliel said, one second, since they're poor, I'll give them this produce of the I got from the Amaretz, and like that I'll pay off my obligation. And Rabban Gamliel says, even though I'm using Demai to pay off a debt, my obligation to feed them, he says, I'm allowed to do it in this case by poor workers, so that workers should be more easily available for the poor. Work should be more easily available, since the poor know that they're going to get fed, they're going to want to do the work, and not when paying other debts. You're not allowed to use Demai for other debts. Even according to Rabban Gamliel, you're only allowed to use Demai when you pay the poor person that's working for you by giving him food, so that work should be more easily available for the poor. However, the Tanna Kama, the Rav says, disagrees. He says you're not allowed to use Demai to pay off any debt, even if they're poor. It's prohibited in all circumstances. So since you owe them food here, you are not allowed to use the Demai to pay off that debt. And the halakha does not follow Rabban Gamliel. The halakha follows the Chachamim that you are not allowed to feed your poor workers Demai. Now, the Mishnah is going to continue to tell us this whole leniency of giving poor people food that is suspected of not being tithed that you bought from Amaretz. It only applies to small amounts of food, like a single meal given to a poor person who begs on the door. However, gabait tzedakah, charity officials, charity collectors, that they provide poor people with a larger amount of food. They give them a lot of food. The rabbis in this case did not exempt them from the Demai obligation. So now the Mishnah is going to discuss, how do we distribute the produce then? Gaba'et tzedakah, charity collectors, who they collect food from the townspeople, from both Amaratzot and Chaverim. They take all the food, they put it into a bin, and now they distribute it to the poor. Bet Shammai say, Notnin et meusar l'she'eno me'aser, bet she'eno meusar le'ma'aser. Bet Shammai say, take all the tithe food that it was a chaver donated it. It was, the tithe was separated. Give that to a person that does not separate ma'asot and amaretz. Since we cannot rely on the fact that he's going to separate it, Bet Shammai say that the gabayat tzedakah have to separate the produce, or they have to make sure that separated produce is given to the Amaratzot. And any untithed food that was donated by Amaratzot, they give to a poor person, a chaver, who does separate Maasrot. Like this, we give the produce to everybody in a way that they could eat it. The poor person will receive tithe produce, and the chaver, who we know will tithe it, will receive produce as well. However, the Rab says we give them extra food, obviously, to make up for the produce that they have to give away as the maaser. As a result, Bet Shammai say, each person who receives food from the charity receives tithed food. We give Demai to only a person we trust that will tithe it. We give Amaratzot food that we know was already tithed. That way nobody eats forbidden food. According to Bet Shammai, you have to make sure that the Amaretz receives food that he could eat right away. Therefore, you have to keep the donations separate according to Bet Shammai. You have to take one bin and put all the food that you got from Amaratzot, because that you're going to give to Tamid Chachamim, and you have to take another bin, put all the food you got from Torah scholars, and give that to the Amaratzot. However, the Chachamim Amrim, the sages disagree. Govin stam mechankin stam. Charity collectors do not have to do this. They can collect all the food without differentiating, put it all in one bin, and they can distribute it all to the poor people without differentiating. They can give it to Amei Aratzot and Chaverim, and the poor person who's willing to tithe it will tithe it. Not that he has the permission not to, but he's obligated to tithe. But the Chachamim say that poor people are going to tithe their own food. Don't worry. Even, obviously, it's not saying that they have the choice not to. They have to do it. But again, the Chachamim say they left it in the hands of the poor person, knowing quite well that there might be some Amei Aratzot that won't tithe it. Now, according to the Chachamim, why don't you separate the bins? Why don't you make all the pile of Amei Aratzot, put in one pile, and Tamid Chanim in another pile? Because the Chachamim said, what happens when Amei Aratz is going to come and he's going to give you food and he's going to see you putting it on the side discreetly? He's going to get insulted. Oh, look what they do to my food. They don't care about my food. Therefore, we're not going to donate anymore. So the Chachamim said, we don't want to make him upset, and then he's not going to give charity at all. We'll put it anyway, since Demai probably was tithed. We're going to put it all in one bin and give it to Amei Aratzot. We have no choice but to rely on the fact that the poor person is going to tithe his own food. In the first case of the Mishnah, when we said we're allowed to feed poor people and passing Jewish soldiers food without separating Demai, there's no obligation to separate. In that case, there was only a stringency. That's because this case was speaking about a single meal being given to the poor person who begs at the door. In this case, by a single meal, you don't have an obligation of Demai. Chachamim were lenient completely. But the charity officials, when you have larger produce, Chachamim did not exempt it from Demai, and therefore they had to have this dispute about how to properly collect it and distribute it. That is the end of today's Mishnah. Amen.